Welcome back to the safe house. So, Trump has, Biden has negotiated a ceasefire with Hamas and Israel. So, you'll notice it was a ceasefire, and whether or not Biden negotiated this deal or his cabinet, or whether it was the incoming president, Donald Trump, doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter. Trump made a comment not too long ago about saying if the hostages taken by Hamas were not released, that when he comes into office, all hell is going to break out in the Middle East. Did that have something to do with the ceasefire negotiations? I can only imagine it did. Now, having said that, you'll notice it was a ceasefire. They're calling it a ceasefire. And so, I just read an article about it yesterday. And the some odd 1,900 Palestinian or Hamas captives are going to be released by Israel, along with the hostages held by Hamas. And this is, it's a 3-stage ceasefire over the course of 6 weeks or something like that. But you'll notice it's a ceasefire. So ceasefire for how long? And now, I bring that up because it's my opinion that Israel does not really want peace. They want to win. They want to expand. The Greater Israeli Project, or the Greater Israel Project, takes part of Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I can't remember all of the territory that it plans on taking. And will it stop there, So as long as Israel continues to see a certain level of violence from the Arab world, it gives them the excuse to continue taking land, continue brutalizing their enemy, blaming all of this on self-defense and terrorism by the Arabs. Look, the IDF, the Mossad, is one of the biggest terrorist groups in the world, at least that part of the world. But they have their hands in all kinds of politics and war and terrorism around the world. As long as Israel can try to convince the world that they're the victim, then they'll maintain a certain level of support around the world, obviously not from their enemies. But I don't think that this is even close to being over. The whole October 7th thing, without getting into a bunch of detail, Israel is supposed to have, and I believe has, one of the most effective intelligence agencies, the Mossad, and the Israeli Special Intelligence Service, I think is what it's called, ISIS, which is interesting. That may or may not be a coincidence. But the idea that this group of people crossed into Israel, I guess they had paragliders. There were a couple of paragliders involved. These aren't stealth fighter jets. I believe it's very possible. I can't say for sure. I don't have access to enough information. But I think it's very possible that Israel knew this was going to happen. They allowed it to happen so that they would have a reason to go out and do what they've been doing. It's almost, probably more now, just over a year this has been going on. And about 50,000 people are dead. And I've heard lots of different numbers. I've heard 10,000 children. I've heard 15,000 children. I've heard 50,000 total, or 46 and some change. I've heard 64 and some change. And these are the people that they can verify are dead. I've also heard that there are thousands of people still under rubble that are obviously dead and or just missing, and that they don't necessarily even count them as dead yet. I've heard numbers approaching 200,000. It's hard to say, but we'll just go with the 45,000. That's insane. That's insane. The United States, which was considered to be a very bloody war, lost 68,000 Americans in Vietnam. And we were there for, I mean, depending on when you call the war an end, 8 to 12 years. And those were all, not that it's really okay, but those were all American soldiers. These people dead in Gaza, and as the result of this war, are not soldiers. Very few would be considered combatants. These are men, women, and children. So I think even if this ceasefire happens, we're far from seeing the end of this. It's go time for Israel. This has always been the plan. And Israel's not going to stop. We may see a lull in the violence, but it's not going to stop. The United States a long time ago should have cut funding off from Israel. You know what's interesting? Israel gets all this funding and all the details I can't tell you. But the broad consensus, the popular consensus is that, you know, they lost 6 million Jews during the Holocaust in World War II under Hitler. And poor Israel, where the people fled, most German Zionist Jews fled, was Israel. And it's some kind of, it's almost like a restitution, only the United States is paying this, and we liberated them. We didn't. Normally, it's the person or entity responsible for this that pays the reparations. So, you know, there's a ton of things about this that just doesn't make sense until you start to look at it like Israel is a colony. It's a colony of the British state or of the Allied forces or the coalition, you know, of countries, a coalition of countries. Then it starts to make sense. Listen, we talked about 9/11 the other day, and I can't tell you, or probably more accurately, I'm probably not going to convince anybody until they do some of their own homework. I can't tell you exactly what happened to bring those towers down. All three buildings, Building 7 as well. But it wasn't the airplanes. I can tell you that. And when you start to look at it, you're like, well, you know, Iraq, there was never really, you know, I remember hearing, oh, they harbor terrorists. Same with the story with Afghanistan. But from my studies, Saddam Hussein was hard on terrorists. And it was not a safe haven for terrorists. Now, was Afghanistan? Possibly. But, you know, Afghanistan is not considered to be some kind of world power. You know, we didn't have a defined target going after just terrorists, so we had to go after nations. So why Iraq? Well, remember the first Iraq war, Operation Liberate Kuwait, whatever they call it, Iraqi freedom. You know, if you look prior to that war, in the years leading up to that war, Saddam Hussein was speaking out against the state of Israel. And Saddam Hussein was one of the in his regime in Iraq was one of the biggest threats to Israel, to Zionism. And now Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset at one time. With the funding of the United States, went to war with Iran. But what was that really about? Well, lots of opinions about there, and there are people that know more about the conflict than I do. But one thing that happened, because Iran is definitely a threat to Israel too. Look who's volleying missiles back and forth with Israel, Iran. Well, one of the things that happened during that war was Iran, another great enemy to Israel, was weakened. They were occupied, fighting a war with Iraq. And eventually Saddam, I think, realized this. And it was after that war that things started to change for the United States and Iraq. Our relations between Iraq and the United States started to change. And so we go into Iraq, first Desert Storm War. And what's one of the first things Saddam Hussein does? The first thing he does in response to that is he launches missiles at Tel Aviv in Israel. Well, Israel didn't attack Iraq. Why would he do that? Well, because he knew something that the American people generally didn't know. Fast forward, we go to war with Iraq again. This time we finish the job, if you will. We kill Saddam Hussein, sentence him to death, we tear apart their regime. And for what? You know, Donald Trump, not that I always believe what Donald Trump says, but he made a good point when he said, you know, Saddam Hussein was not a good guy, but Iraq is worse off now than they were under him. So what was the point? Why did we go there? To liberate the people? That would be wonderful if I thought the United States was the kind of country that would just do things out of the kindness of their heart and go liberate people because it's the right thing to do. But if that was the case, if that's what our MO was, there's a lot of countries that need liberated. Why do we invade certain countries that need liberated but not others? Well, there are a lot of reasons. A lot of reasons. So Afghanistan. What was Afghanistan about? Well, right after we went into Afghanistan, a couple of things happened. There was a oil pipeline that went right through Afghanistan that they constructed. One of the first things that started happening. And Afghanistan's heroin production also went from between 10 to 15% of the world's heroin to 90% of the world's heroin. So one thing that happened after 9/11 is we went to war and we're back. We went to war, excuse me. Power goes out here. We have a generator that kicks in, but welcome. Bienvenidos a la Republic Dominicana. Welcome to the Dominican Republic. But after 9/11, the United States started making their presence in the Middle East and fighting Israel's enemies. We went into Afghanistan, we installed a pipeline, or whoever did it, I don't know who owns it. And the opium and heroin production, relatively speaking, in the world, all of a sudden, the world's opium and heroin market share shifted into the hands of Afghanistan. or whoever controls the heroin there. You know, it's like in Vietnam. Look at all the heroin that was coming out, or the opium that was coming out of that part of the world. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. You think, oh, that's wild. You know, that's crazy talk. The United States would sacrifice America's soldiers, men and women, over some kind of drug war. Well, look at the opium wars. I mean, so for those of you that aren't familiar and that haven't studied it, go look at the opium wars. First war, I think, was in 1839. And the British East Indian Trading Company, to compensate, you know, China was selling silk and all kinds of goods to Great Britain, to the UK. And if you're not selling something back, it becomes lopsided. So they started selling heroin, of whom the Rothschilds and the Sassoon family, which, interestingly enough, Sassoon family was a Jewish Iraqi family back in that time period, and one of the richest families in the world for a while there, if they're not still, you know. And there was inter-family marrying between the Sassoons and the Rothschilds. So, and we remember now the Balfour Declaration of 1917, giving basically Palestine by the British, given to the Rothschilds family. Dear Lord Rothschild, in the Balfour Declaration, first three words. Well, they were involved in the heroin trade 150, 200 years ago. There was a war fought between England and China because after a huge portion of the population became addicted to opium, something like 25%, and of which were mostly like military service age men, were addicted to opium. So it was strategy as well to weaken China. And China decided they didn't like that, and they were going to put a stop to it. And England and the people behind the heroin trade, the Sassoon family, the Rothschilds, got England to go fight this war for the right to be able to contaminate China's population with opium and heroin. I mean, how evil is that? So you don't think that these very powerful people are still in the drug trade today? It's no less. It's, I'm sure, a larger industry today than it was then. And is there, this could be, this is just a thought, but could there be a correlation between the war in Afghanistan ending and heroin in the United States becoming less popular, and fentanyl, which is a synthetic heroin essentially, far more powerful and addictive, the rise of that and the diminishing of heroin use? Maybe it wasn't as profitable anymore. Maybe it wasn't as necessary to go in there and secure. You know, my nephew was 101st Airborne, and he fought in Afghanistan. And I remember him telling me that one of the most beautiful things about that country was when the opium or the poppy flowers would bloom. You just see a sea of like pink or purple. And sometimes they'd come into an area where there were opium fields all over, or hash field or marijuana fields. And they'd get there and they'd wait for orders. Sometimes they would be ordered to destroy the field, and sometimes they would be ordered to just leave it and move on. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? And remember what I said. Before the Afghanistan war, Afghanistan was responsible for about 10 to 15% of the world's heroin. And after we went in there, within just a couple of years, it was 90% of the world's heroin. Afghanistan produced 90% of the world's heroin. Sounds like almost like a turf war or like a drug war, but not the kind where you're trying to get drugs off of the streets. You're jockeying for market share. And it's been said that a lot of this drug money, like in the Contras, when the Sandinistas and the Contras down in Nicaragua, all that rigmarole going on, they were funding covert wars, that war down there against communism, or you might say for control of the drug industry. You might say that they were, somewhat of a personal opinion here, just from the things that I've studied. Could have been a war against communism, and it could have also been a war against other people that wanted to control the drug industry and or didn't want the drug industry. And we would allow open gates into the United States, i.e. the 80s crack epidemic, to sell cocaine in the United States and use that money, or at least parts of it, to go fight wars in South America and other places in the world. A lot changed. 9/11 was a turning point for the United States and for the world. And for the world. This war on terrorism, you're either with us, you're either for us or against us. You're welcome to your own opinion, but one of the things that I see happened was we went and made a presence in a part of the world where Israel had a ton of enemies. We went and helped a country increase their heroin market share and opium by five times. and when we left, what did we really do for the Afghanis? Just like when we left Iraq, what did we really do for them? Is Iraq a better nation today? I'm sure there's arguments that can be made, but it's like multiple people in our government and military have said, Iraq, what we did is we went and destabilized Iraq. Now Iraq is not a unified force that can go and threaten the sovereignty of Israel. Now I'm sure everything has been organized in Afghanistan where the heroin production continued to roll, whatever role heroin has in the world. And as long as our media covers the right stories and doesn't cover the wrong stories, these narratives aren't heard. And they say ignorance is bliss, and a lot of times I admire people that just don't desire this information and go out of their way to dig it up. I'm not insulting those people. This is just something that interests me. I feel an obligation to it. I feel a responsibility to truth. And so many people watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. They might tune into a PBS broadcasting documentary or something sometime, or Vice News, which Vice covers some interesting topics, but for the most part they're just getting the filtered horse shit that they want people to see, or that they will allow people to see. But you're not gonna tune into any kind of mainstream media and then tell you that there could be a connection between the Rothschilds or the Sassoons or the whatever families now. I'm sure there's plenty of names that are hard to even read on the internet that are some of the richest people in the world we just don't even hear about. But you're not going to hear the connection between a heroin and opium market and these people. All you're going to hear is that we went into Afghanistan to go after the people that were responsible for 9/11. We went into Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. And as long as the media doesn't cover that, and they make out the people that are uncovering this information or the whistleblowers to just be lunatics or, crazy conspiracy theorists, the vast majority of people will believe that. It's not that they don't think the information will get out. It's just that as long as it's a small enough number of people that know this stuff, it's not a threat. They don't really care. They wouldn't care at all if anybody knew this shit, except for it would alter people's opinions, and people would start to demand changes. Because it is, the vast majority of the United States and every country are not politicians. They're not business tycoons. They're not military officers. They're average, everyday people. And it is us that actually has the power if we were ever to unite. But we're busy arguing about LGBTQA, RF15, whatever. The alphabet now. We're too busy moving backwards in racial, the whole race issue, racism, and it's mind-boggling to me. About abortion, they don't give a shit about these things. They don't care if you do or don't abort your child. They don't care if you do or don't get along with somebody of a different race than you. They don't give a shit if you want to get married to another man or another woman, of somebody of the same sex, or what you identify with. Okay, I don't want to sound insensitive here, but like gay rights and being accepted in the community has turned into ze, zem, he, they, shim, shem, rim, rim. Nobody gives a shit what you identify as. And it's so much of it is turned into, I've said this before, this is like the victim generation of victimhood. Everybody's got to look for a way to be more unique, more oppressed, more of the center of attention. They've got to have somebody that's bullying them so that they can be so brave and courageous. Nobody gives a shit. I'm sorry. Go identify with whatever you want. You can post it all over social media too. You have that freedom. I'm just saying that the vast, vast majority of us don't give a shit what you identify with. And or if you pierce your nipples and shave lightning bolts in your head, we don't care. You don't have to go parade down the street screaming at people, acting like the victim. If you just went and identified with whatever the hell you want and didn't act like a brat, nobody would give a shit. Just go do it. You're in the United States. There's no law to change. There's no law to change. This isn't some country in Africa where it's illegal. You can make out in public. But just know that if you're going to make noise, you're going to hear some people's opinions. So if you truly don't want to hear their opinion, just shut up. Just shut up. Nobody cares. You don't have to be the center of attention. You don't always have to be the victim. Just go about your life. This is the United States. You have the freedom to be who you want and identify as what you want. And we have the freedom to not give a shit or even judge you, so long as we don't violate your personal rights. You don't violate my personal rights. I won't violate your personal rights. And with that, you got to have a little bit you got to have some thick skin sometimes. Not everybody's going to like me. Not everybody likes me, trust me. And I'm a middle-aged, straight, white male, as privileged as they get. And there are people that dislike me for a multitude of reasons. So, if we want to continue to just fight about all this shit, instead of spending our time educating ourselves, understanding what's going on, and then doing something about it. I made the comment the other day that we have an obligation to the world. You know how many people out there in the world where our foreign policy directly affects their lives, sometimes as the result taking their lives or the lives of loved ones, and they have no right to vote for our political leaders, of whom make our foreign policy, decide what our foreign policy will be. It's the people in the United States that can vote that get to do that. So all these people in Ukraine that are dying and fighting, and the family members and the schools and the churches and the hospitals and everything that have been destroyed, those people that are feeling the consequences of that, even if they wanted to, they don't get to vote in our country. Yet, and probably some have, because of, we don't need an ID. You got to have an ID to drive a car at 16, but you don't need an ID to implement one of the most important aspects of a democratically elected constitutional republic. So we can keep fighting about all this nonsense, which nothing needs to change except for people just need to shut up and go about their lives. While other people around the world, other people really face consequences. It's like in Israel. Israel doesn't exist without our funding. Not the way it does. And it's been this way since it's the start of Israel. The United States is funding genocide, and it didn't start October 7th. They have been systematically taking rights away, stealing land, pushing them out, terrorizing and murdering the Palestinian people for a long time now, for 80 years. And we fund it. You want to know what happens to political leaders in the United States that threaten the funding and or try to hold Israel accountable with nuclear projects, or people that try to kick the Federal Reserve out of the United States and issue a national currency rather than a currency issued by an outside entity that has no obligation to the United States. They shoot him in the head in front of all of the world to see. That's what happens. If you think that somehow Oswald had more of a motive to kill the President of the United States than Israel did, you haven't studied, and you enviously, I say, you live in a bubble. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, comment below. Until next time.